Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We assume that's the Bahamas. 544 miles per hour, 46, 56 degrees.
Nice to see you here on this miserable day. Before I begin, let me just say that I don't know how many of you have any familiarity with what you're going to be seeing tonight. And I don't mean the movie, but I mean the research that the movie is about. So I'm going to say a few words beforehand, and then I'm going to let you watch the movie, and then I'm going to have a talk afterwards. I just want to make a correction. I didn't actually work with Stanley. I was his colleague, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So I live in Huntington Village. I wrote a couple of notes here. I live in Huntington Village, and my wife and I, Liz, have been members of the Cinema Arts Center for a very long time. And so as a local resident and friend of the Cinema Arts Center, I'm really, really pleased to be here today. So I want to talk a little bit about Stanley's career before you get to see the man as depicted by Peter Sarsgaard. Stanley had and this is relevant to what you're going to be seeing in the movie and may put a little bit of a context on it. Stanley had a very unusual academic career. He received his PhD from Harvard in 1960. And then he went to Yale as an assistant professor for 3 years. It was during those 3 years, and just during those 3 years, that he did his famous obedience research. So by 1963, the obedience research was finished. After his 3 years at Yale, he was an assistant professor at Yale. He moved on to Harvard, where again, he was an assistant professor. 3 years into his assistant professorship, they decided at Harvard that he wasn't going to get tenure. And in fact, they demoted him from assistant professor to lecturer for a year. What happened after that, and just so you're aware of this, the normal trajectory for a professor is you start off as a, wet behind the ears assistant professor. If you work hard and you're lucky, you become a tenured associate professor. Then you go on to full professor. And that's the trajectory that one would expect someone like Stanley to go on. But no, he was assistant professor at 2 places, then became a lecturer, and didn't get tenure. After 3 years, in 1967, the City University of New York, which is, I will call CUNY from now on, offered him a full professorship with tenure. Now, how do you go from being a lecturer to a full professorship in tenure? It was because by 1967, Stanley was already a world-famous psychologist as a result of the obedience research he had done at Yale. This was despite the fact that it was over 10 years after the completion of the obedience research that he wrote the book that fully described his work. And I'd like you to put on the first slide now, please. The name of the book is Obedience to Authority, and it's really the only place where you can see the full scope of the 17 studies he did in those 3 years at Yale. So that book, published in 1974, just to indicate how well known Milgram was already at that point, let me show you the next slide. See if this works. Oh, I have to turn it on, don't I? They always say turn it on. If it doesn't work, put in the plug, turn it on. Okay, there we go. Now, let's see if it works. When the German edition of the book came out, which was the same year, by the way, the name of the book was Das Milgram Experiment. Now, you don't call a book Das Milgram Experiment unless people will recognize what that means instantaneously. That's how well known he was by the time his own book, Obedience to Authority, came out. I met Stanley for the first time when I was appointed as an assistant professor at the CUNY Graduate Center in the program, it was a PhD program in social psychology and personality psychology. By the way, some of you may know about that building. It's the building next to the Grace Building on 42nd Street between 5th and 6th. It's the building, if you've ever walked by right opposite Bryant Park, where you can walk through it and go from 42nd Street to 43rd Street. That's where the Graduate Center was when I got my position there. Now it's the New York College of Optometry, and the Graduate Center is now in the old Saks building at the corner of 34th and 5th. Altman's, excuse me. I always get those department stores mixed up because when I got my PhD, I went to the New School, which had taken over another department store, which was, what was the name of that department store? It was the one with the maternity stuff in it. I don't remember, but their motto was, it was at the corner of 5th Avenue, this is really a digression, it was at the corner of 5th Avenue and 14th Street, and its motto was, 5th Avenue, it wasn't Klein's. Klein's was at the Union Square. No, it wasn't Orbeck. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It wasn't Mays. It doesn't matter. But here's the point. Their motto was 5th Avenue quality at 14th Street prices. And we at the New School had our own motto, 14th Street quality at 5th Avenue prices. But in any case, the new Graduate Center is at the corner, right opposite across from the Empire State Building. Anyway, as being part of a small department, I got to know Stanley very well. I was never really his close friend, but I certainly interacted with him very much. I didn't actually work with him, but not as a researcher, but as a professor and colleague. I was enormously intimidated by him when I came in as a young assistant professor, and when I left as a full professor, I was still enormously intimidated by him. He was a very difficult and very remarkable person. And I think you'll get some feeling from the portrayal in this movie about that. This movie is a very accurate depiction of both him and the research that he did, and the reactions to it. Unlike a TV movie which was made, it seems to me, 1 million years ago, starring William Shatner. Does anybody remember this one? It was called The Final Level, and it was based on Milgram's work, and it was a hodgepodge that had very little to do with what Milgram really did. You're actually going to see William Shatner, not played by himself, in this movie tonight. The accuracy is really quite remarkable. The director and writer spent a lot of time interviewing people who knew Stanley, and he had the help of Stanley's wife, Sasha. Many of the lines that Peter Sarsgaard speaks in the movie are direct quotations from Stanley Milgram, most of them from his book, Obedience to Authority. There's one minor inaccuracy in the picture, in the film. Let's see if I can do it. This is the Social Personality Program, circa 1980. You can draw all kinds of conclusions about what's changed since 1980. I know, it looks like the Trump cabinet. But yeah, there is a woman there. Oh, I think there's one in the Trump cabinet. The formidable-looking gentleman, third from the left in the front, is Stanley. The goofy-looking one at the upper right is me. And there's, as I say, there's one inaccuracy in the movie, or at least a very minor inaccuracy. In the movie, you actually get to see when Stanley gets the package from Germany and opens up this package and he sees Das Milgram experiment. In the movie, Sasha is in the office with him, but I know that's not how it happened because I was in the office with him and I really don't look that much like Winona Ryder, although I look more like her then than I do now, but what can you do? So we can cut the slide. So what I'd like to do is, let's watch the movie now. Now afterwards I'm going to discuss a number of issues that are raised in the film and about the research. Following the talk, I hope there will be time for a Q&A and also for your own reactions and comments. So with no more ado, I think we should dim the lights and watch the movie. Enjoy.
Sorry, I forgot to mention that Peter Sarsgaard, who plays Stanley Milgram, and Winona Ryder plays his wife, Sasha. And it's directed by...
Just waiting for this to go over so I can put my first slide up. But this isn't going to be one of those just, PowerPoints where I read what's up there and then go on to the next thing and read what's up there. I've been to so many lectures like that, they drive me crazy. I'm just going to put up some points and, points of reference for a discussion. And as soon as this is over, I'll show you what those points are. But when I get to the last point, which is, what do we think of Stanley Milgram as a person? I'd like to hear what you have to say about that, but I'd also like you to remind me that there's one other inaccuracy in the film, and that has to do with his death. So maybe somebody will remind me about that if I forget. Normally, we can just walk out at this point, right? I'm always amazed how many people it takes to make a movie. It's really amazing. Okay, good. So, okay, so here are the things that I'd like to talk about. And as I say, after I'm done, I hope we'll have time for some questions, comments, and so on. First of all, do we believe the results of the experiment? Was the research ethical? Would you, all of us here, in that situation, have followed orders? Does the experiment help explain the Nazis? Why did some follow orders while others didn't? And was this, since this is science on screen, let's ask the question, was this science, performance art, or something in between? And then we'll get some discussion about Milgram as a person. So, let's see if this really works. Okay, do you believe the results of the experiment? This is I don't actually want you to tell me the answer here. This is a point of discussion. So some psychologists were skeptical and this is really true, and argued that the participants were only pretending to believe that the person the learner was really being shot. Now you might say, how could that be? They acted all upset and they did all this. Well, these psychologists, and I'm not going to go into the details of this research, but these psychologists have done studies that show that when a person is in an experiment like this, they will often play the role that they believe is expected of them. And if in fact they thought this was, and when I say thought, I don't mean consciously, but if they had a sense that this was the way they were supposed to respond, some sixth sense about what the experimenter really wanted them to do, they could fake it. And this was a serious criticism at the time. So in trying, the problem here, of course, is if the subjects, who were the teachers, really didn't believe the person was getting shot. And again, you might say, well, why would they not believe it? Because, you go into an experiment, somebody's telling you to practically kill somebody. Some part of you is saying, I can't believe this is really true. So how do you do an experiment where you can rule that out? Well, I'm going to read you. I'm going to do a little bit of reading here, not too much, but I'm going to read you this thing called the fluffy shock the puppy experiment. And this is actually taking this from Wikipedia. When Stanley Milgram published the results of his obedience experiment in 1963, it sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Other researchers found it hard to believe that people could so easily be manipulated, and they searched for any mistakes Milgram might have made. Charles Sheridan and Richard King theorized that perhaps Milgram's subjects had merely played along with the experiment because they realized the victim was faking his cries of pain. To test this possibility, Sheridan and King decided to repeat Milgram's experiment, introducing one significant difference. Instead of using an actor, they would use an actual victim who would really get shocked. Obviously, they couldn't use a human for this purpose, so they used the next best thing, a cute, fluffy puppy. Sheridan and King told their subjects, volunteers from an undergraduate psych course, that the puppy was being trained to distinguish between a flickering and a steady light. It had to stand either to the right or to the left, depending on the cue from the light, whether it was flickering or steady. If the animal failed to stand in the correct place, the subjects had to press a switch to shock it. As in the Milgram experiment, the shock level increased 15 volts for every wrong answer. But unlike the Milgram experiment, the puppy was really shocked. As the voltage increased, the puppy first barked, then jumped up and down, and finally started howling with pain. The volunteers were horrified. They paced back and forth, hyperventilated, and gestured with their hands to show the puppy where to stand. Many openly wept. Yet the majority of them, 20 out of 26, kept pushing the shock button right up to the maximum voltage. So the point here was that presumably a puppy could not be trained to pretend to be shocked, and supposedly, therefore, the participants in the study really believed, and with good reason, that the puppy was being shocked because the puppy was being shocked. Unfortunately, I mention this because it's an example of what you might do, and it's all over the internet, I might add. If you look up shock the puppy experiment, you'll find it. This study was never published. It was never subjected to peer review, which means it was never looked at by psychologists and others who might decide whether it was worthy of being published. Never was published. It's still all over the internet. So I'm not sure what to make of it. I don't even know if it really ever happened. However, that's, I suppose, the kind of thing that one might do if one wanted to test the idea that the subjects in the experiment didn't believe it was real. Okay. The acid test, and since this is science on screen, I'm going to be a little bit sciencey about this. The acid test for taking results of experiments seriously is that they've been replicated. And I can't stress this enough. Too many times, those of you who read the New York Times, I imagine many of you do, are probably somewhat familiar with the many articles that seem to come out in the op-ed sections on Sunday about this social scientist found that, and that social scientist found this. Many of these are reports of studies that were done for the first time and have not been replicated. The fact is now known that the majority of studies that are reported are not and probably cannot be replicated. Because there are a lot of reasons why a study works, so to speak. Replication is the key to believing something is true. We live in a world of alternate facts. We don't want science to have alternate facts. And the proof against that is that a study or a finding is replicated. So, and we especially like to see replications in other labs. Now, Milgram himself replicated his study many, many times, as you saw in the film. We're going to get back to that issue of replication in a minute. Now let's talk about that elephant. Was that what the elephant was? I'm not sure what the elephant was. I thought it was the Republican Party, but it couldn't have been. Was the research ethical? So there are three aspects of the question of ethics, right? One is deception, which was talked about a lot in the film. Another is stress, putting the participants under unusual amounts of stress. And the third is lack of informed consent. Now, these are all related. For example, if you're deceiving, if you need to deceive someone in an experiment, how do you get informed consent? Informed consent means that the subject is told everything that's going to happen. Well, here's the kind of the tricky part about that. it's okay to tell them what's going to happen, and I'll show you in a minute where that all comes from, without telling them why it's happening. It's not considered deception not to tell them why what's happening is happening. It is considered, I mean, it's not considered lack of informed consent to say that, but it is considered lack of informed consent to put the subject in a situation where they're going to experience something they had no way of expecting, especially if it's going to be stressful. Now, deception is a funny business in psychology. There's virtually no decent social psychology experiment I can think of that does not use deception, because you can't let people know exactly what's going on. The trick is not doing a deception that is not, how shall I put it, that creates a false impression of the world, that gives people the wrong idea about science, and which hopefully you can debrief them about afterwards. Now, deception, Milgram's experiments in deception are probably the most extreme that we know about. But even when I do experiments, I have to do some sort of deception. For example, I did a study on the effects of pleasant and unpleasant odors on people's memories. Now, I couldn't tell them that that's what I was doing, right? I gave them a whole thing called a cover story about how odors influence people's feelings. I didn't tell them it had anything to do with their memories. That was a deception. I gave them a false story. When the study was over, I debriefed them and told them what the study was really about. The problem, especially if you're working in a university and you're using undergraduates as your subjects, which is all too often the case, the problem is as soon as you tell one the real story, that can get out to other people. You may remember that when Milgram first started doing his research, he didn't actually debrief the subjects. He didn't tell them that it was false. He told them that they weren't getting such strong shocks. Why did he do this? Because he was afraid they would, quote, contaminate other subjects who might come into the experiment. The issue of stress is also an interesting one. Certainly, these people in the Milgram experiment were put under a huge amount of stress. And probably, in some ways, even though deception was the thing that was mentioned the most in the film, I think most people's sort of horror about the Milgram studies, and especially when they say he should have been the one getting shocked, is the amount of stress that these people were put under. Now, Milgram, as you saw in the film, claimed that most of his, if almost all of his subjects, felt that they had gotten something positive out of this experience. They had learned something about themselves in the sense that the stress was worth it. Hard to know if that's really the case. So, that continues to be an issue. The issue of stress is a complicated one. It's hard to do experiments about real important things sometimes in social psychology, without putting people under stress. In fact, when he tells in the movie his students to go out and sing in the bus, he's putting the students under stress. That was part of what the point of it was. And by the way, these are really the things he did in his research classes. So, as you saw, the Milgram experiments made an impact on how we think about psychology research. And in fact, were instrumental in leading to what are called institutional review boards, or IRBs. I'm going to read you a brief description of that. Formal review procedures for institutional human subject studies were originally developed in direct response to research abuses in the 20th century, including the Milgram obedience experiment. The results of these abuses was the National Research Act of 1974 and the development of the Belmont Report, which outlined the primary ethical principles in human subjects review. These include respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. An IRB may only approve research for which the risks to subjects are balanced by potential benefits to society. Informed consent from participants is also generally needed. However, this requirement may be waived in certain circumstances, for example, when the risk of harm to participants is clearly minimal. One of the justifications Milgram made was this notion of beneficence. what that means is there has to be a benefit to the subject. And Milgram claimed that his subjects felt that by and large, in fact, like I don't know what the number was, 80% felt that they had benefited, they had learned something. And Milgram made one point, I remember, that I thought, it's not in the movie, but I thought was really something I had felt also. When I was at Queens College, we had people doing perception research that involved looking at dots and lines and things for 3 hours and making responses like this. And Milgram said, that is unethical, to put people through 3 hours of total boredom and to have them get nothing out of it when it was all over except a sense of what the heck was this all about. Anyways. Okay. To move on to the next issue. Oh, right, no, I forgot. I wanted to get back to the replication. So, sorry, my mind is slipping a bit. So, as was pointed out in the movie, one of the problems, as I said before, that replication is so important, except after Milgram's studies and their notoriety, it became impossible for anybody to actually replicate them. Nobody would approve that replication. And look what happened to Milgram from the studies. He was demoted to lecturer and didn't get tenure at Harvard. So how do you replicate a study like this and get approval from the Institutional Review Board? In 2009, Jerry Berger did a sort of a very interesting variant on the Milgram experiment that in fact did pass muster with the IRB. The main adjustment was that, there were a number of adjustments. The main adjustment was that the participants, when they got to the 150 volt, remember it goes up to 450, when they got to the 150 volt, the teacher, the participant, would either go on to the next one or not. In other words, at 150, this is what Berger was looking at 150 is the point at which the subject, the learner, started really expressing discomfort and pain. And what Berger said is, you know, if you look at the original Milgram studies, anybody who went beyond 150 was likely to go to the very end. So he figured, well, what I'll do is I'll go up to the 150, you know, we'll go to the 150. If the subject then is willing to, the participant is willing to read the pair, you know, the words that would lead him to the next shock level, we stop the experiment. And if he doesn't agree, then the experiment would stop anyway, that he would be one of the people who disobeyed. So no subject ever went beyond the so-called 150 volt level, and therefore the subjects were never really exposed to that kind of stress. And that was one of many modifications he made that allowed him to get approval from the Institutional Review Board. His results were very, very similar to Milgram's, by the way. And this was done in 2009. One of the reasons he wanted to do it was to say, gee, there's been a lot of changes in society. I mean, just look at the picture of the social personality program, all white guys with one woman. There have been a lot of changes. What would happen if we tried this in 2009? Would we get the same results? The answer is yes, you'd get the same results. This wasn't a flash in the pan. Okay, so this is something I would like you to ask yourself, but I don't want you to raise your hands about it. Would you have, you've seen the film now, would you have done what these people did in the same circumstance? As described in the film, Milgram described the experimental details in great detail to various people, including psychiatrists. He asked them to estimate how many participants would continue to the final level. In every case, people were quite sure almost nobody would do so. Okay? In my classes, when I was teaching, and I would teach big lecture classes, 100, 120 people in some classes, I had described the procedures in detail to my students before they'd read about the study and asked them if they thought they would continue to the final level. Not one thought they would continue to the final level. Even after studying the experiment and learning of its results, very few students were willing to say that they would have continued to shock the learner. Now again, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I would like you all at least to think about what this kind of information tells us about you and me and all the other decent people we know. So one of the most important ideas in social psychology is that people are not accurate at predicting how they will respond in situations they've not previously experienced. This is one of the things that Milgram mentions in the film. We are very bad at predicting how we are going to react if we are told, well, how would you feel if you won the lottery? Or how would you act if so-and-so did this? How would you act if somebody told you to shock somebody to the point where you thought you might have killed them? We don't know, because from the outside, we think of ourselves as autonomous people. We think about our own feelings, our own thoughts, our own moral values. What we don't realize is that when we get into certain kinds of situations, there are forces in that situation that can overwhelm that sense of our own autonomy. And that is one of the major points. Social psychology in general makes a big deal about what is called the power of the situation. That situations that people get into are much more powerful in determining their behaviors than they anticipate. Does the experiment explain the Nazi? Now, when I say explain it, obviously I don't mean explain it in the broader sense. I do mean in the sense that it's discussed in the movie. Does it explain why so-called normal, ordinary people were willing to carry out the horrendous acts that the Nazis perpetrated? Let's talk about this for a minute. So on one hand, we have the Hannah Arendt notion of the banality of evil. That these are ordinary people. This is the kind of thing Milgram was talking about. These are ordinary people caught up in a system where they end up being agentic. That is, they begin to feel themselves as agents of somebody else's will, to put it that way, versus Hitler's willing executioners. Now, you're all movie lovers, and I'll bet many of you have seen my favorite movie, Lawrence of Arabia. How many people have seen Lawrence of Arabia? Great movie, I think best movie ever. Anyway, Steve Spielberg said it had the best screenplay ever. There's a line in there that some of you may remember, where Lawrence is talking to his superior, and he's saying he doesn't want to go back into the desert. He doesn't want to go back to leading the army. He says that he had to kill a man. He was given the job of executing a man. You may remember this scene. He says to the general, I don't want to go back because, quote, there was something about it I didn't like. I enjoyed it. Now, in the film, Lawrence of Arabia, this is a man struggling with his own demons. And in a sense, we now get to this question: to what extent are people in the experiment responding to things inside them that they may not be aware of, but which are being permitted by the experiment? So let's talk about the banality of evil versus Hitler's willing experimenters, and this is going to sort of segue into a somewhat Freudian perspective. It's not necessarily the one I have, but the one we need to get on the table. Again, I'm going to read this. In 1992, the American historian Christopher Browning published a book titled Ordinary Men about the Reserve Police Battalion 101, which had been used in 1942 to to massacre and round up Jews for deportation to the Nazi death camps in German-occupied Poland. The conclusion of the book, which was much influenced by the Milgram experiment on obedience, was that the men of Unit 101 were not demons or Nazi fanatics, but ordinary middle-aged men of working-class background from Hamburg. These men were ordered to round up Jews, and if there was not enough room for them on the trains, to shoot them. In other, more chilling cases, they were ordered simply to kill a specified number of Jews in a given town or area. In one instance, the commander of the unit gave his men the choice of opting out of this duty if they found it too unpleasant. The majority chose not to exercise that option, resulting in fewer than 15 men out of a battalion of 500 opting out. Browning argued that the men of Unit 101 agreed willingly to participate in massacres out of a basic obedience to authority and peer pressure, not bloodlust or primal hatred. Milgram experiment. In his review of Ordinary Men, Daniel Goldhagen disagreed with Browning's central interpretation that the killing was done in the context of the ordinary sociological phenomenon of obedience to authority. Goldhagen instead contended that the vast majority of the perpetrators were not ordinary men as we usually understand men to be, but ordinary members of an extraordinary political culture, the culture of Nazi Germany, which was possessed of a hallucinatory, lethal view of the Jews. That view was the mainspring of what was, in essence, voluntary barbarism. Goldhagen stated that he would write a book that would rebut Ordinary Men and Browning's thesis and prove instead that it was the murderous anti-Semitic nature of German culture that led the men of Reserve Battalion 101 to murder Jews. That book was Hitler's Willing Executioners. So we go to Sigmund Freud, our old friend that we turn to every now and then, and you know, Freud talked about the id, the ego, the superego. There's a part of us that is the beast that we keep under wraps most of the time, but can be released, especially if there is permission for it. So think about the election and Trump and his supporters, for example. You knew I was going to bring Trump into this, right? It's inevitable. Everybody does these days. But there's a reason for this. Many people felt that the sudden upsurge in hate crimes, the willingness of people to express negative feelings about others was given permission by Trump and his campaign. So here we have a sense that it's under the surface, right? It's there, and all it needed was permission to start coming out. Well, one could interpret the Milgram studies in a similar way, that we all have these impulses that were given permission by the experiment. I'm going to quote Milgram now about this. He writes in his book, "One theoretical interpretation of the behavior, that is the obedience, holds that men harbor deeply aggressive instincts continually pressing for expression, and that the experiment provides institutional justification for the release of these impulses. According to this view, if a person is placed in a situation where he has complete power over another individual, whom he may punish as much as he likes, all that is sadistic and bestial in man comes to the fore." A little bit of purple prose there by Stanley. But he actually thought he could test this idea, this proposition. Remember I said he did like 17 different varieties of the study, some of which are shown in the film. But one that wasn't shown was the idea that in order to test this concept that the experiment simply allowed people to vent their aggressive instincts, he did a variation in which subjects were not ordered to increase the voltage, but were free to select any voltage as long as they did administer the shocks. So in other words, they had to follow the same procedure, but remember in the kind of basic Milgram study, you have to keep increasing the shocks each time. In this version, he said we have to give a shock if the learner gives the wrong answer, but you can choose whatever voltage you want. Almost all of the subjects chose to administer very low shock levels, even before the learner objected. Milgram took this as evidence that it wasn't that the experiment gave people the permission to vent their bestial aggression, but that, in fact, it was obedience to authority. Now, I'm not sure I totally buy this argument, but I think it's interesting to me that he thought of it and he was willing to try to test it. Okay, so what do we have next? Yeah, that's what I just did. So why did some follow orders and others not? Now we know there were some conditions in the experiment where people didn't follow orders. For example, in one, again, this wasn't in the movie, but in one variant, he actually had a person who was not a scientist given the job of actually telling the teacher to do the shocking. Under those conditions, people did not obey as much, and nowhere near as much. The person simply giving the orders didn't have the authority to get the subject to get into this agentic state. He wouldn't. The participant did not accept that an ordinary other person could give them the order to shock somebody. It had to be somebody that was authoritative. You might say, well, isn't it interesting to know why 35% generally did not follow orders? In the base experiment, not in the variations that he did, but in the base experiment, the one that's been repeated over and over, one way or another, where 65% went to the final level and 35% broke off at some point. And by the way, you may not realize this, even if they broke off at 400 volts, they would have been considered not being obedient. Okay, they had to go all the way to 450. That's where the 65% went, to the end, when the person was no longer speaking, had said, I have a heart attack. Okay, it's important that you remember and understand that part of it. So why did some people stop and were able to say to the experimenter, I'm not going any further? You might think it has something to do with personality. Well, maybe it does, and Milgram didn't reject this idea out of hand. However, both he and others have tried to find some personality characteristic that might predict who would follow orders and who wouldn't. All came up empty. Okay, all came up empty. There's never been any really persuasive case made that you could say, this kind of person will not follow the orders. This person is more moral, this person is more this person is more that. They couldn't find anything like that. Milgram really did not know, and we still don't know, why some followed orders and others didn't. Milgram says, for some reason, these people were able to find their own autonomy, and that was stronger for them than the agentic state, this idea of being an agent of somebody else's will. But he couldn't say why those people had that ability, and others didn't. Okay, so just a little bit of a digression about science for a moment. Many people have said, and in fact, in the eulogy that my colleague Erwin Katz gave for Stanley at the Riverside Chapel in Manhattan after his death, he talked about the research as being almost more like a performance art than science. Now, why did he say this? And why has there always been a question about whether this is real science or not? So first of all, think about, was any theory being tested? Was there any hypothesis? You know, when Stanley began the research, he expected people to be disobedient. And what he was interested in was, you know, what the process of disobedience would be. He was shocked, no pun intended, when he first did the study and found 65% of the people following the orders. But did he have any theory? Not really. Was there really an hypothesis? Not really. No more in a sense than Alan Funt had in Candid Camera, right? Let's put people in a situation and see what will happen. So this is what typically is, when I teach experimental psychology, this is what I tell people experiments involve. They involve a hypothesis. They involve at least two conditions, an experiment and a control condition. They have to have random assignment of subjects to different conditions. They have to have statistical tests of significance. None of those are in Milgram's experiments. I don't remember any statistics in the entire book. Now, this was one of the reasons Milgram had trouble publishing the study at first. They said, there's no theory, this isn't science. Remember, it took him 2 years to get this stuff published, and the journal he got published in was not a top-rate journal. His lack of interest in theory, you might have even picked this up in the movie. He does, let's see what happens if people look up in the sky. Let's see if people can identify the people on the platform with them. Let's see, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's never really a theory, and there's never really a test of the theory. His brilliance is in the performance, in the setting up of the illusion. He's like a theatrical producer. And his theorizing comes after the fact. And this was to me, very interestingly demonstrated in the last type of research he was doing before his death. He had developed something called the Cyranoid technique, which is Cyranoid based on the concept of the idea of Cyrano de Bergerac. Now you may remember that Cyrano, what he did was, because of his big nose, he was too embarrassed to go after Roxanne, so he got this, whatever his name was, to woo her reading his poetry. So he would stand behind the building and he would say the poem, and does anyone remember the name of the guy? So you remember Cyrano's name? Yeah, and the guy would say the poem to Roxanne. All he was doing was saying what Cyrano was saying. So what Milgram did is he set up a situation where he put little earphones in people's ears. He was in the control room with a microphone. The person had the earphone and a mic. And the person would then interact with somebody who was actually the subject. But the person would not realize that he was actually interacting with Milgram. In other words, Milgram would train these people to be able to repeat everything he was saying as he was saying it. And now it's interesting to think of this, talk about controlling people. This was like turning another human being literally into a puppet. Okay? Do you all sort of get what I'm talking about here? Milgram is having a conversation with you, but you don't realize it. You think you're having a conversation with this fella, but this guy is simply saying what Milgram is saying in response to you. Now, it's a brilliant idea for theater. We got a memo sent around to us in the faculty, because we all had heard about this. We knew he was doing the Cyranoid work. And he said, I have the Cyranoid technique. Can anybody think of any idea we could test with it? That's the way Milgram was. He was fascinated and curious, and he wanted to see what would happen if, but he was really not a classic scientist in that sense. Okay, so your impression of Milgram as a person, and if anyone wants to say something about that before we get into a general Q&A. Anybody have any thoughts about that based on what you saw? I know people who think he was a monster, literally. I have a friend who says he's a monster. I don't want to know about his research. Anybody have an impression? Well, if you don't, I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes, and then we can go on to the Q&A. No more. Oh, yeah.
I think that I'm a psychologist. I think that Milgram was absolutely right on target and brilliant. Like, there are other things that you can look at to verify some of his findings. Besides Freud, there's the Stanford prison experiment.
Sure. Which is sort of the other side of the coin. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
The Stanford prison experiment.
Yeah, the Stanford-
Again demonstrated
Right.
context.
It demonstrates something else, but it demonstrates the power of situations over people's actions. And again, nobody expects they're going to respond the way they did. In the Stanford prison experiment, which you've probably all heard about, undergraduates were turned into guards in a fake prison, and they became more and more brutal very quickly as they had the power to be. Yes?
Yeah, also, I read something a while back that also, I read something that verifies Milgram's idea and also the Stanford prison experiment in a much more relaxed and normal kind of condition where people just self-identify as they enter a classic room, like a large auditorium but with desks or whatever, and before they go in, they're told they're going to answer some questions or whatever, and they have to self-identify whether they consider themselves a progressive or a progressive Democrat or in other words, what side of the spectrum they consider themselves on. What they found was if half the people, and they didn't isolate one group from another, it was just random, but they had the statistics of who identified how. If they were brought into one room with a lot of conservative, patriotic, normal, for that side of things, rhetoric on the walls, which had nothing to do with the questions on the thing, they would respond to questions with the kind of bent that you saw with the, and vice versa. If there were like pictures of Vietnam protests and things like that on the walls, there was a higher percentage all the time, every time they did it, of people who went against what they self-identified for based on the room they were in.
Right. So this is a typical social psychology kind of situation. I would not call it necessarily the same as Milgram. I think it's important. Malleability, yes, but malleability to the point of thinking you might have killed somebody. Remember, these people who went to the 450 voltage, this guy had said, I have a heart attack, let me out of here, I have a heart condition, and then he stopped responding. And they kept shocking him. This is an order of magnitude. Okay, so let me tell you something about Stanley. He was very autocratic. I think that may have come across. He liked manipulating people. He really did. He enjoyed it. I used to think of him as like a spider with flies in his web. His curiosity was boundless. And he was incredibly creative, but he was also incredibly brave. Stanley Milgram had 5 heart attacks. The first heart attack, by the way, I remember a conversation I had with him before his first heart attack. At the time, I was doing research on something called subjective life expectancy. I was interested in if people had lost a parent at an early age of the parent, which I had, my father died at 50, how would that impact their own sense about how long they were going to live? And what would it do to their health behavior? Would they tend to become more vigilant about their health, less vigilant about their health? Anyway, I was doing this research. And Stanley's father had died at age 50. And he and I were talking in his office about it, and I was telling him about the study, and he said, I don't expect to live beyond my father. Just like that. Anyway, after his first heart attack, this is a man who was world famous, who was at the graduate center. Most of his students were PhD students, but at that time, all of us who were working there also had to teach an undergraduate class at one of the City University campuses. And he was teaching a big lecture class in social psychology at City College when he had his first heart attack. It was on the day of their exam. And as he was being wheeled into the hospital, all he could talk about was, who's going to go give the exam to these kids? Who's going to take care of that? The day of his last heart attack was not at all like it was shown in the film. He was going to a dissertation defense of a student He wasn't even one of his main students. He was on the dissertation committee, and he was going to a dissertation defense. And he started having a heart attack sometime during the day. And he insisted on going to this dissertation defense. At the end of the defense, he was so pale and sick-looking that my colleague Erwin Katz said, "I've got to get you home." Took him home on the train to Riverdale. His wife took him to the hospital, and he died. I had spoken with him between heart attack 1 and heart attack 5. And he had said to me, I said, "Well, how do you feel? You know, you have this heart condition that they say is not treatable." It was very severe. And by the way, we were always worried about not upsetting him or not doing anything that would cause him to have another heart attack. And he said, "I'm not afraid of dying." He said, "I've done so much. I've done what I wanted to do. My kids are in great shape." He said, "I'm really not afraid of dying." And I believed it. And that seemed to have been the case. And yet, this was a man who terrified his students, who insulted them, who humiliated them often, and yet was so loyal to them that many of them loved him. And those are the ones that didn't hate him. So he was quite a person to be a colleague with, and I hope you learned something about him and about science and also about yourselves and human nature, and thank you for coming.